The fog over Lake Pontchartrain was a shroud, thick and pearly gray in the pre-dawn light. It muffled the world, swallowing the distant hum of the causeway and the gentle lapping of water against the hull of the Southern Belle. For the two Coast Guard officers in the approaching patrol boat, the silence was the first thing that felt wrong. A 50-foot luxury yacht like this, even anchored out, should have had some sign of life, music, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of conversation. But the Southern Belle was as quiet as a tomb. They'd received a call from a concerned fisherman who'd noticed it drifting, its anchor lines snapped and trailing uselessly in the murky water. Officer Davies, the younger of the two, hailed the yacht over the radio. The only answer was the crackle of static. After a second failed attempt, his partner, a veteran named McCall, cut the engine. "Something's not right," McCall grunted, his eyes scanning the pristine white deck. "Let's board her, cautiously." The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken dread. As they secured their boat and climbed aboard, the scene was one of frozen revelry. Empty champagne flutes and half-eaten plates of hors d'oeuvres littered the teak tables. A silk scarf lay abandoned on a lounge chair, fluttering in the faint breeze. It was a ghost ship, the party long over, but the evidence left behind. They moved through the main salon, their boots echoing on the polished wood floors, before descending the narrow stairs to the lower deck. One of the cabin doors was slightly ajar. McCall pushed it open. The smell hit them first, cloying and metallic. Then their eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through a porthole. What they saw would be seared into their minds forever. On the large disheveled bed lay the body of a woman, but this was no peaceful passing. Her face was locked in a silent scream, her mouth stretched unnaturally wide by a grotesque metal device. A second, similar contraption was visible between her legs, surrounded by a dark, horrific stain that had soaked through the expensive linens and onto the mattress below. The scene was a violation, a tableau of unimaginable agony. It was a horror that defied explanation, a quiet, bloody scream in the heart of the morning's stillness. 48 hours earlier, that same woman, Teresa Tess Washington, had been vibrant and full of a nervous, fluttering hope. At 51, life had etched lines of worry and weariness around her eyes, but it hadn't extinguished their light. She stood in the gleaming, cavernous kitchen of the Dubois mansion in the Garden District, polishing a silver serving tray until her own reflection stared back at her. For 20 years, she had worked as a cleaner and housekeeper for the family, a silent witness to their lives of effortless privilege. Mrs. Dubois floated into the kitchen, her voice a tinkling bell of passive aggression. "Oh, Teresa, you're still here? I thought you'd be finished by now. We're having the gardeners over tonight, so everything must be absolutely perfect." Tess just nodded, her smile polite but tight. "Yes, ma'am. I'm just finishing up." The Dubois family represented the quiet, insidious racism Tess had navigated her whole life. It wasn't in slurs or overt hatred, but in the constant, subtle reminders of her place. She was the help, an invisible fixture in their perfect world. They never asked about her life, her family, her dreams. They didn't know that her husband, Marcus, had died 3 years ago, leaving a void that echoed in their small, tidy apartment. They didn't know that, for the first time since his death, her heart was beating with a rhythm that was more than just survival. It was anticipation. Later that evening, she stood before the mirror in her bedroom, a place that was solely hers. The dress she'd chosen was a deep sapphire blue, elegant and modest. It didn't try to make her look younger, but it made her feel beautiful. She was meeting him tonight. Dante. The name itself felt like a poem on her lips. She had met him a few weeks ago, on a rare whim, when she'd stopped for a single drink at a new jazz club after a grueling day at work. He was the bartender, 31 years old, with eyes that saw past the tired cleaning woman and seemed to find the woman she used to be, the woman she still hoped she could be. He had made her feel visible. Tonight was their first official date. As she applied a touch of lipstick, her hands trembled slightly. She took a deep breath, looking at the hopeful, anxious woman in the mirror. It was just a date, she told herself. But it felt like so much more. It felt like a chance to live again, to step out of the shadows of her quiet life and into the light. The tragic irony was that she was stepping into a darkness far deeper than she could ever imagine. Janelle's hair. Haven wasn't just a salon, it was the heart of the neighborhood, a sanctuary of hot combs, gossip, and unwavering sisterhood. The air hung thick with the scent of hairspray and burnt orange incense, a backdrop to the constant buzz of conversation and the soulful rhythm of an old Etta James record. Janelle, with her ever-changing vibrant hair, this week a fiery crimson, was the high priestess of this domain. When Tess walked in the next day, Janelle took one look at her friend's face and knew. The glow was unmistakable. "All right, spill it," Janelle said, pointing a comb at Tess as she settled into a vacant styling chair. "You look like you swallowed a firefly. Who is he?" Tess couldn't suppress the smile that spread across her face. "His name is Dante." Janelle's hands paused midair. "Dante? The bartender from that new spot, the Blue Note? The one who's young?" "He's 31, Tess confirmed, her voice a mix of defiance and glee. "And he's incredible, Janelle. He's smart, he's funny, and he actually listens. We talked for hours." Janelle's expression shifted from curiosity to a familiar, protective concern. She'd been Tess's rock since Marcus passed, guiding her through the suffocating waves of grief. She knew the depths of Tess's loneliness. But this felt different. This felt dangerous. "Tess, honey, listen to me," she began, her tone softening. "A man that young, that good-looking, in a place like that? What does he want with a woman our age? And don't you dare say our age. You know what I mean." "He wants me," Tess said, a little too quickly. "He says he's tired of girls his age, all caught up in their phones and drama. He said he was drawn to my elegance, my substance." Janelle let out a low whistle, turning back to the mirror to meet Tess's eyes in the reflection. "Elegance and substance? Girl, that's a line. A damn good one, but it's a line. You know how some of these men are, especially the white ones, or the ones who run in those circles. They look at a beautiful, experienced black woman like you, and they don't see a partner. They see an experience, a notch on their belt, something exotic to tell their friends about." The mention of race, though Dante was black, hung in the air. The circles Janelle referred to were the integrated, artsy, often wealthy crowds that frequented the newer, trendier parts of New Orleans. Crowds that often fetishized black culture without understanding or respecting the people who created it. "He's not like that," Tess insisted, though a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "He's different. He's a craftsman, an artist." "An artist of what? Mixing cocktails?" Janelle snorted. "No, something else. He makes custom pieces for collectors. It's a niche market," he said, "very high-end." Tess's explanation was vague because Dante's had been. It was part of his mystique, the air of mystery that she found so compelling. To Janelle, it sounded like a smokescreen. "A niche market," Janelle repeated skeptically, starting to section Tess's hair. "Look, I'm not trying to rain on your parade. Lord knows you deserve some sunshine, but you are a precious cargo, Teresa Washington. You've been through enough. I just don't want to see you get hurt by some smooth-talking boy who sees you as his weekend project." She paused, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Loneliness is a powerful thirst, honey. Just be careful you're not drinking poison because you're dying for a glass of water." Tess looked down at her hands, her earlier euphoria beginning to fade, replaced by a stubborn resolve. "I'm not a naive girl, Janelle. I'm a 51-year-old woman. I know what I'm doing. He makes me feel alive again, truly alive. Isn't that worth a little risk?" Janelle sighed, the sound a mix of resignation and love. She knew she couldn't change Tess's mind. The hope was too strong, a beacon after 3 long years of darkness. "Okay," she said, her hands moving expertly through Tess's hair. "You're a grown woman, but you promise me one thing?" "What's that?" "You keep your eyes wide open. Don't let that charm blind you to what's real. And if anything at all, feels off, you call me, day or night. You hear me?" "I hear you," Tess promised, meeting her friend's worried gaze in the mirror. But even as she said it, she knew she was already too far gone. The water Dante was offering was too sweet, too intoxicating, and she was too thirsty to question its source. The whispers of caution on Frenchman Street were no match for the siren song of a new beginning. The Blue Note wasn't on the main drag of Bourbon Street with its neon sludge and sticky sidewalks. It was tucked away on a cobblestone alley in the Marigny, a place you had to know to find. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood, bourbon, and the ghosts of 1,000 jazz solos. A lone saxophone wept from a dimly lit stage, the notes curling like smoke around the sparse, attentive audience. This was Dante's world, and as he led Tess to a secluded corner booth, she felt like she'd been granted entry into a secret society. He wasn't in his bartender uniform tonight. He wore a simple, well-fitted black shirt that hinted at the strong shoulders beneath. His smile, when it landed on her, was a physical force, making the years of her invisibility melt away. "I'm so glad you came," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. "I'm glad you invited me," Tess replied, her own voice sounding breathier than she intended. The conversation flowed as easily as the expensive wine he ordered. He asked her about her life, not just the polite surface-level questions, but real ones. He wanted to know what music she loved as a girl, what her biggest regret was, what she dreamed about now. He listened with an unnerving intensity, his dark eyes fixed on hers, making her feel like she was the only person in the room. He was a master at creating intimacy, at building a world that consisted only of the two of them. When she in turn asked about his work, the mysterious, custom pieces, he leaned forward, a conspiratorial glint in his eye. "It's complicated," he began. "I create tools for exploration. Most people live their lives inside a tiny, comfortable box. They're afraid of their own desires, their own depths. I make things that help them find the key to that box." "What kind of things?" Tess pressed, intrigued. "Think of it as functional art," he explained, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass. "Leather, steel, wood, all meticulously crafted. I work with clients who want to explore the boundaries of pleasure and trust. It's a very specific, intimate kind of work. Everything I make is built on one principle: absolute safety. You can't truly let go, you can't truly explore, unless you feel completely 100% safe." The words were hypnotic, painting a picture of a dark, thrilling world governed by rules and consent. It was so far removed from her life of church on Sundays and quiet evenings alone. It was terrifying and electrifying all at once. The first tiny, almost imperceptible red flag fluttered in her mind. This was a world she knew nothing about, a world of deliberate risk. She must have shown a flicker of apprehension, because he immediately softened his tone, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. His touch was warm and firm. "Hey," he said gently, "it's not for everyone. I get that. But the philosophy behind it is universal. Trust, communication, honoring your partner's limits. Isn't that what any good relationship is about?" He had expertly reframed the conversation, pulling it back from the brink of the strange and taboo, and grounding it in the familiar language of love and respect. Tess felt her anxiety recede, replaced by admiration. He wasn't just a handsome young man, he was a deep thinker, a man of principle. Later, as they walked through the quiet streets of the French Quarter, the sound of their footsteps echoing on the ancient stones, he stopped under the amber glow of a gas lamp. "You're a remarkable woman, Teresa," he said, his voice low. "You have this strength in you, this grace, but I also see a fire you keep hidden away. I'd like to get to know that fire." Before she could respond, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a hungry, demanding kiss, but one of profound tenderness that still held a promise of something deeper, something more intense. It was a kiss that made her feel cherished and desired in a way she hadn't in years. In that moment, under the flickering gaslight, any lingering doubts she had were extinguished. The red flags, the whispers of Janelle's warnings, the strangeness of his profession, all of it faded into the background. All that mattered was the intoxicating feeling of his lips on hers and the seductive promise of the world he was offering. He wasn't just a man, he was an escape, and she was more than ready to be set free. The shadows he dealt in no longer seemed menacing. They seemed like a velvet curtain, and she was desperate to see what lay behind it. A week later, their relationship had accelerated from a slow burn to a wildfire. Dante was intoxicating, a constant presence in her thoughts and, increasingly, her life. One sweltering afternoon, he finally said the words she had been both dreading and craving. "I want to show you my workshop. I want you to see what I really do." He drove her to an industrial district on the outskirts of Algiers, a desolate landscape of corrugated metal warehouses and sun-bleached asphalt. He pulled up to a large, windowless building that looked abandoned, its metal door scarred with rust. For a moment, a cold spike of fear shot through Tess. This was the kind of place where bad things happened in movies. But then, Dante turned to her, his smile reassuring, and the fear subsided, replaced by a thrill of transgression. Inside, the contrast was jarring. The space was vast and meticulously organized, more like a surgeon's laboratory than a craftsman's studio. Tools of every conceivable shape and size hung from pegboards in perfect alignment. Rolls of rich dark leather were stacked neatly on shelves. Spools of waxed thread, metal buckles, and polished steel rings were sorted into labeled bins. The air smelled of oil, leather, and sawdust. It was a place of serious, focused creation. "This is it," he said, a note of profound pride in his voice. He walked her through the space, his hands gently grazing over his creations. He showed her elegantly braided whips that looked more like art pieces than instruments of pain, intricately stitched leather harnesses, and polished metal collars. He spoke about each one not in terms of its function, but in terms of its philosophy. "See this?" he said, picking up a heavy leather cuff with a polished steel D-ring. "The stitching has to be perfect, not just for aesthetics, but for strength. The edges are beveled and burnished, so they're smooth against the skin. No chafing, no discomfort. The person wearing this is placing their trust in the person holding the leash. My job is to honor that trust. My work has to be flawless because the stakes are so high." Tess listened, mesmerized. He spoke with the passion of a true artist. He wasn't a purveyor of smut. He was a facilitator of profound human connection, an architect of trust. He made the dark and forbidden sound beautiful, even noble. He was chipping away at her defenses piece by piece, replacing her conventional morality with his own seductive logic. Then he led her to a heavy steel workbench at the back of the studio. On it, clamped in a vise, was a half-assembled metal object. It was pear-shaped, segmented, and intricate. "This is my new project," he said, his eyes gleaming with an almost manic intensity. "My masterpiece. I'm rethinking a centuries-old design." He explained it was based on a medieval torture device, but he was re-engineering it for pleasure, transforming an instrument of agony into one of ecstasy. The mechanism, he explained, was the key. It had to be perfectly smooth, perfectly controllable. He gestured to a bin of discarded parts on the floor. "Prototyping is a bitch," he said with a wry smile. "Had a bit of a scare last month. I was stress testing an earlier version of the locking mechanism." He picked up a small, twisted piece of metal. "This little locking pin here, it sheared under extreme pressure. The whole thing just failed, gave way all at once." He tossed the mangled pin back into the bin with a clatter. A cold unease trickled down Tess's spine. "Is that dangerous?" she asked, her voice quiet. Dante's focus snapped back to her, and he seemed to realize his mistake. He quickly waved a dismissive hand. "Oh God, no, not on a person. This was in a hydraulic press. I test everything to at least 10 times the force it would ever encounter in real-world use. That failure was a gift. It showed me a weakness. I've since redesigned the pin, used a tempered steel alloy, and tripled its tensile strength. The new design is fail-safe, absolutely, positively foolproof." His explanation was confident, technical, and utterly convincing. He made the failure sound like a triumph of engineering, a necessary step on the path to perfection. Tess accepted it, pushing the image of sheared metal and sudden failure from her mind. She wanted to believe him. The allure of his confidence was stronger than the quiet warning bell of her intuition. As they left the workshop, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, Dante pulled her close. "Thank you for coming," he whispered against her hair, "for seeing me, the real me." Tess felt a surge of pride and intimacy. He had shared his secret world with her, and she hadn't run away. She had passed a test she didn't even know she was taking. That evening, he invited her to a party on a client's yacht that weekend. "You should come," he'd urged. "I want to show you off." The invitation felt like a confirmation, a final step into his world. The image of the failed pin was a distant memory, a minor footnote in the thrilling story he was writing for them, a story she was now a willing character in. Part 5. A Stranger at Sea. The yacht was named the Crescent Queen, and it glittered under the New Orleans sky like a shard of fallen moonlight. As Dante helped Tess across the gangway, she felt a dizzying sense of dislocation. The deck was crowded with people who seemed to have stepped out of a magazine, impossibly beautiful, effortlessly cool, and overwhelmingly white. They were a mix of artists, tech entrepreneurs, and old money heirs, all laughing and sipping champagne as a DJ spun a thumping bass-heavy track. Tess had spent her life in the background of places like this, a silent cleaner in the periphery of wealth. Now she was a guest, and the role felt ill-fitting, like a borrowed dress that was too tight in the shoulders. She clutched her simple clutch purse, suddenly hyper-aware of her sapphire blue dress, which had felt so elegant in her bedroom mirror, but now seemed painfully modest and out of place. Dante, however, moved through the crowd with an easy confidence, his hand possessively on the small of her back. He was in his element. "Everyone, this is Teresa," he announced to a small group clustered near the bar. The conversation paused. 6 pairs of eyes turned to her, their gazes a quick, assessing sweep, from her face to her dress, to the age etched into her skin, and finally landing on her hand, intertwined with Dante's. The smiles they offered were polite but lacked warmth. A young woman with platinum blonde hair and a dress that seemed to be made of strategically placed silver chains stepped forward. "Dante, darling," she purred, ignoring Tess completely. "We were just talking about your latest commission. Marcus is absolutely thrilled." "Glad to hear it, Chloe," Dante said smoothly, before turning back to Tess. "Teresa, this is Chloe. Her husband is a devoted collector of my work." Chloe finally acknowledged Tess, her eyes flickering with a kind of predatory curiosity. "Oh, lovely to meet you," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Are you also one of Dante's connoisseurs?" The question hung in the air, thick with insinuation. Tess felt a hot blush creep up her neck. She was being sized up, categorized, and dismissed in a single sentence. She was the older black woman, the novelty, Dante's latest experiment. "I'm a friend," Tess said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. Throughout the evening, the subtle slights continued. A man asked her if she could point him toward the restroom, assuming she was staff. Another guest, a young tech bro with a vapid grin, cornered them and said to Dante, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Dude, I love it. So authentic." Tess knew exactly what he meant. She wasn't a person to him. She was an accessory, a symbol of Dante's edgy, transgressive tastes. She felt a growing sense of isolation, a profound and lonely otherness. Dante seemed to play a strange double role. On one hand, he was protective, steering her away from the more obnoxious guests and whispering reassurances in her ear. On the other, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was enjoying the spectacle. He liked the way heads turned when they walked by. He was proud of the quiet shock and whispered speculation they caused. Her discomfort was a testament to his power, his ability to break social norms. As the yacht pulled away from the marina and out into the vast darkness of Lake Pontchartrain, the city lights shrinking to a glittering smear on the horizon, Tess felt a pang of deep unease. She was adrift, literally and figuratively, in a world where she didn't belong, with a man she was realizing she might not truly know. She watched him across the deck, laughing with a group of people who looked at her like a curiosity. For the first time, she saw him not as her savior from loneliness, but as the architect of it. He must have sensed her withdrawal, because he detached himself from the group and made his way back to her side, handing her a fresh glass of wine. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I don't think I fit in here," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper above the music. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. His embrace felt less like comfort and more like possession. "Don't worry about them," he murmured into her hair. "They don't matter. Only we matter. Tonight is about us. In fact, I have something special planned, something just for you and me, away from all this." He gestured with his head toward the stairs leading to the lower cabins. The promise of privacy, of escaping the judging eyes on the deck, was a powerful lure. It was a chance to reclaim the intimacy she had felt with him in the quiet jazz bar, to believe again that she was more than just his authentic guest. She nodded, allowing him to lead her away from the noise and the lights, down into the belly of the yacht, not realizing she was walking out of a world of subtle cruelties, and into one of absolute horror. The cabin was a cocoon of silence after the pulsating chaos of the deck party. The air was cool, the lighting low and intimate. Muffled bass from the music above vibrated faintly through the floor, a distant reminder of the world they had left behind. For the first time all night, Tess felt like she could breathe. The space was small but luxurious, dominated by a large bed covered in a plush, cream-colored duvet. It felt like a sanctuary. "Better?" Dante asked, closing the door behind them and shutting out the last of the noise. Tess nodded, a genuine smile returning to her face. "Much better." He came to her and kissed her, a long, deep kiss that was meant to erase the discomfort of the past hour. It worked. Under his touch, she felt her anxieties melt away, her body softening against his. "I told you tonight was about us," he whispered against her lips. "I want to give you something, an experience you'll never forget." He moved to a built-in wardrobe and retrieved a small rectangular box covered in black velvet. He handled it with the reverence of a jeweler presenting a rare diamond. He placed it on the bed and sat down, patting the spot beside him. Tess sat, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "I've been working on these for months," he said, his voice low and intense as he opened the box. "They're my finest creation. I call them the Eternity Pairs." Nestled on a bed of black satin were two objects, both shaped like pears, forged from highly polished gunmetal gray steel. They were beautiful in a severe, almost menacing way, their surfaces reflecting the dim cabin light. They were cool, precise, and utterly alien. Tess recognized the shape from a history documentary she'd once seen, and a chill traced its way down her spine. "They look like something from the Middle Ages," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're inspired by an old design," Dante acknowledged, a flicker of pride in his eyes that she knew their history. "But I've completely re-engineered them. The originals were instruments of coercion and pain. Mine are instruments of trust and pleasure. They are the ultimate expression of surrender." He picked one up, its weight solid in his palm. He showed her a small neural dial at its base. "It's all in the mechanism," he explained, his tone shifting to that of the passionate engineer she'd seen in his workshop. "It's a precision machine screw drive, infinitely adjustable. It allows the segments to expand smoothly, slowly, giving you a sensation of fullness that is indescribable, and it's completely safe. The new locking pin design is foolproof. There is no possibility of failure." He said the last words with such absolute conviction that it felt like a sacred vow. He was selling her a fantasy, not just of physical pleasure, but of perfect safety, of absolute control in a world that felt so out of control. He was offering her a way to connect with him on a level beyond words, a physical manifestation of the trust she so desperately wanted to place in him. "I want us to try them," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "I want you to trust me, completely. We will go as slow as you want. The second you want to stop, we stop. You are in complete control." All of her doubts, all of Janelle's warnings, all the discomfort she felt on the deck, it all came rushing back, a frantic chorus of caution in her mind. This was the precipice. This was the moment of choice. She could say no, get dressed, and walk back up to that deck of strangers, her relationship with Dante likely fractured beyond repair. She would be alone again, the brief, brilliant flame of her new life extinguished, left with nothing but the quiet hum of her refrigerator and the crushing weight of her solitude. Or she could say yes. She could take this leap of faith. She could trust this man who made her feel beautiful and seen. She could prove to him, and to herself, that she was not old and fearful, but bold and alive. She looked from the cold steel objects to the warmth in Dante's eyes. He wasn't a monster, he was an artist, and she was to be his muse. The desire to be chosen, to be special, to be part of his secret, beautiful, dangerous world was a gravitational pull she could no longer resist. "Okay," she whispered, the word feeling both like a surrender and a declaration of power. "I trust you." A slow smile spread across Dante's face. It was a smile of triumph, of validation. He set the devices on the nightstand and turned to her, his hands gently cradling her face. "You won't regret this," he promised. As he began to undress her, his movements slow and deliberate, a single terrifying thought echoed in the back of her mind. What if he was wrong? The beginning was a symphony of care and precision. Dante was the perfect conductor, orchestrating every moment with a gentle, practiced hand. He moved slowly, his touch worshipful, whispering praise against her skin, telling her she was beautiful, powerful, brave. He was erasing the 51 years of weariness and replacing them with a feeling of timeless desirability. Tess, bathed in the warm glow of his adoration, allowed herself to let go, to surrender not just to him, but to the promise of the experience. When he finally reached for the devices on the nightstand, her body was already humming with arousal, her mind lulled into a state of deep, trusting calm. He chose the larger of the two first, lubricating it carefully. "Ready?" he asked again, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. She gave a single, decisive nod. The sensation of the cool metal entering her was strange, a foreign presence, but not unpleasant. Dante was patient, his movements sure and slow, allowing her body to accommodate the device. Once it was fully in place, he looked at her again. "How do you feel?" "Okay," she breathed out. "It's different." "Different is good," he smiled. "Now for the magic." He showed her his hand on the small dial at the base. "I'm going to turn this very, very slowly. You'll feel a sense of fullness, of stretching. You tell me when it's enough, you tell me when to stop." He began to turn the dial. Inside her, Tess felt the metal segments begin to separate, a slow, controlled expansion. It was an intense pressure, a unique sensation that was neither pain nor pleasure, but something entirely new. It was fascinating. "More?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. She nodded, caught up in the strangeness of it all. He gave the dial another slight turn. The pressure increased. "Stop!" she gasped, the sensation reaching a thrilling peak. "Right there." He immediately stopped, his control absolute. He leaned down to kiss her, his hands resuming their exploration of her body, layering new sensations on top of the intense fullness within her. Next, he picked up the second, smaller device. "Ready for this one?" he whispered. Again she nodded, her inhibitions dissolving in the heat of the moment. He gently placed the oral device in her mouth, letting her grow accustomed to the feel of it. "I'll expand it just a little," he said. "Tap my arm if it's too much." He turned the second dial, her mouth filled with the expanding metal, her lips stretching. It was deeply vulnerable, but under his watchful gaze, it felt safe. With both devices in place, expanded to a limit she had chosen, he pulled back to look at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and desire. "Incredible," he breathed. "You are absolutely incredible." Tess couldn't speak, but she met his gaze, her own eyes conveying a complex mix of trust, excitement, and arousal. He caressed her, bringing her closer and closer to a climax, the internal pressure from the devices heightening every sensation. As she neared the edge, he reached for the dial on the vaginal device again. "Just a little more?" he asked, his voice husky. "To send you over?" Lost in the moment, wanting to please him, wanting to feel everything he had promised, she nodded again. It was the last voluntary decision she would ever make. He gave the dial a final, small turn. And then they both heard it, not a loud crack, but a tiny, sickening snap. A sound no bigger than a fingernail breaking, but it was the sound of the world ending. Dante's eyes shot wide open in horror. The confident artist vanished, replaced by a panicked boy. "Oh no!" he whispered, his hand fumbling with the dial, trying to reverse it. But it wouldn't turn. It was frozen. At the same time, Tess felt a horrific, grinding lurch inside her. The smooth, controlled expansion was gone. The device was opening on its own, its metal segments tearing into her with brutal, mechanical force. A pain unlike anything she had ever known erupted in her core, a blinding, searing agony. She tried to scream, but the device in her mouth, which a moment ago had been a tool of pleasure, was now a gag. It too had failed. With a sharp jerk, it expanded violently, splitting the corners of her lips, the pressure on her jaw becoming unbearable. A strangled, guttural sound was all she could manage. Her eyes, wide with terror and agony, pleaded with him. "Help me. Get them out." "Shit! Shit! It's broken!" Dante cried, yanking frantically at the vaginal device. But it was embedded too deeply, its expanded segments acting like an anchor. He couldn't move it. Blood began to seep from between her legs, a dark, hot flood against his hands. It welled up in her mouth, trickling from her torn lips. He stared at his blood-soaked hands, his face a mask of pure terror. The mechanism, the one he had boasted was fail-safe, the one he had staked his artistry and her safety on, had catastrophically, horrifically failed. The artist was gone. The engineer was gone. All that was left was the horrifying evidence of his fatal pride. Panic is a cold, clarifying fire. In that instant, as Tess's body was being torn apart by his creation, Dante's mind fractured into two distinct parts. One part screamed in horror at the unfolding nightmare, the blood, the silent, pleading eyes, the mechanical grinding of his own failure. But the other part, a colder, more ancient and reptilian instinct, took complete control. It wasn't the instinct to save, to help, to call for aid. It was the instinct to survive. His thoughts began to race, not with solutions, but with consequences. Jail, lawsuit, ruin, murder. The word echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of the cabin, a silence broken only by Tess's agonized, muffled gasps. His entire life, the persona he had so carefully constructed, the artist, the master craftsman, the purveyor of safe exploration, was dissolving in the pool of her blood. "I have to get help," he mumbled, the words sounding hollow and false even to his own ears. He stumbled back from the bed, away from her, as if her pain were a contagion. He looked at his hands slick and crimson, and a wave of revulsion washed over him. He wiped them frantically on the bed sheets, another stain on the canvas of his crime. He turned away from her. He couldn't look at her anymore. He couldn't bear to see the trust she had placed in him being so brutally betrayed. Looking at her was looking at his own monstrous failure. So, he focused on the door. Escape. His movements became sharp, methodical, chillingly purposeful. He snatched his shirt from the floor and pulled it on, his fingers clumsy but quick. He shoved his feet into his shoes, not bothering with the laces. His mind was a checklist of self-preservation, witnesses, evidence, traces. He scanned the cabin, his artist's eye for detail, now repurposed for a more sinister task. He grabbed a towel from the small bathroom and began wiping down every surface he could remember touching. The doorknob, the velvet box, the nightstand, the champagne flute he'd brought down for her. Each wipe was an act of erasure, an attempt to scrub himself from the narrative, to sever his connection to the horror on the bed. Tess was still alive. Her chest hitched in ragged, shallow breaths. A low, continuous moan escaped from behind the metal gag. Through the haze of her agony, she watched him. She watched the man who had whispered words of love and safety to her just minutes before, the man she had trusted with her body and her heart, meticulously erasing his own existence while she bled to death. It was the final, most profound cruelty. He grabbed his wallet and keys from the pocket of his discarded pants. He gave the room one last, sweeping glance. His eyes flickered toward the bed, toward her, for a fraction of a second. But he didn't truly see her. He saw only a problem to be escaped. There was no hesitation, no final moment of remorse. The part of him that might have felt compassion or responsibility had been cauterized by fear. He slipped out of the cabin, closing the door gently behind him, leaving her alone in the blood-soaked silence. He climbed the stairs, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The party on the deck was still in full swing, the music a deafening wall of sound that perfectly masked his escape. He kept his head down, melting into the shadows along the edge of the yacht, his movements fluid and unseen. No one noticed the dark stains on his cuffs. No one saw the wild, hunted look in his eyes. He made his way to the stern, where a small inflatable dinghy with an outboard motor was tethered for emergencies. His hands, still trembling, worked at the knots. He cast one last glance back at the laughing, oblivious crowd, a world he no longer belonged to. He was a ghost now, a fugitive from his own life. He lowered himself into the dinghy, started the small motor with a single angry pull, and sped away into the vast, unforgiving darkness of the lake, leaving the Crescent Queen and its dying secret behind him. The sound of his escape was swallowed by the music in the night, and Teresa Washington was left utterly and completely alone to face the silence. Detective Frank Miller stood on the deck of the Crescent Queen, the morning sun glinting off the water, and felt a familiar wave of weariness. New Orleans had a way of serving up horrors that were both baroque and brutal, and this was one for the books. His partner, Detective Lena Chen, a sharp, no-nonsense transplant from San Francisco, was beside him, her notebook already filling with observations. Their initial walkthrough of the crime scene had been grim. The medical examiner had confirmed the obvious. The cause of death was massive hemorrhaging and shock caused by the horrific internal injuries. The two metal devices, now bagged as evidence, sat on the galley table, inert and sinister. Before they could even begin a proper investigation, a man in a crisp $1,000 suit intercepted them. He was the yacht owner's lawyer. "Detectives," he said, his voice smooth as bourbon. "A terrible tragedy. My client is devastated. From what we can gather, the woman, Teresa was it, was engaged in a rather extreme form of consensual activity. It appears a faulty piece of equipment was involved. A tragic accident, born from a risky lifestyle." Miller felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. The narrative was already being written for them. Blame the victim. The lawyer was painting Tess as a thrill-seeker who got what was coming to her, neatly deflecting any responsibility from his client for what happened on his vessel. It was a classic play, and in a city where justice often depended on who you knew, it was an effective one. The initial theory from the precinct, colored by the lawyer's spin and a healthy dose of institutional bias, started to lean that way. Maybe it was drugs, one of the uniformed officers suggested. People do crazy things when they're high. And they saw a 51-year-old black woman dead on a rich man's yacht with sex toys inside her, and their minds filled in the blanks with a story of reckless abandon. It was easier than confronting the ugliness of the truth. But Miller had seen the look on the victim's face. It wasn't ecstasy. It was pure, unadulterated terror. This wasn't a game gone wrong. This was something else. The turning point came that afternoon, in the form of a woman who stormed into the precinct like a Category 5 hurricane. Her hair was a shock of crimson, and her eyes burned with a grief so fierce it seemed to suck the air out of the room. "My name is Janelle Roberts," she announced to the desk sergeant, "and I'm here about my friend, Tess Washington. The police told her daughter it was an accident. That is a lie, and I'm not leaving until I speak to the detectives in charge." Miller and Chen led her into a small, sterile interview room. Janelle sat down, but couldn't stay still, her hands twisting in her lap. "Tess wasn't reckless," she began, her voice shaking with rage and sorrow. "She was lonely, there's a difference. She was seeing a young man named Dante Williams." Chen's pen began to fly across her notepad. "Dante Williams?" "Yes," Janelle said, leaning forward. "He's a bartender at the Blue Note, but that's not his real job. He makes things, sick things. He calls it art. He makes devices for what he calls exploration. Tess told me about it. She told me about him inviting her to this party. I warned her. God, I warned her something felt wrong about him." Janelle's testimony was a sledgehammer to the risky lifestyle narrative. She gave them a name, a motive, and a context. She painted a picture not of a reckless thrill seeker, but of a vulnerable, hopeful woman who had been manipulated by a charismatic predator. She told them about Tess's fears, her loneliness, and her deep desire to feel loved again. She gave Tess a voice. "You find him," Janelle said, her eyes locking onto Miller's. She pointed a trembling finger at him. "You don't let them sweep my friend under the rug like she was nothing. She was a good woman. She mattered. You find the man who did this to her." Her words hung in the air, a sacred charge. For Miller, the case had just transformed. It was no longer just another bizarre NOLA homicide. It was a crusade. Janelle's fierce loyalty had cut through the prejudice and the assumptions, forcing them to see the victim as a person, not a statistic. The investigation, which had been in danger of being steered into a convenient dead end, was now firmly on track. Their target had a name, Dante Williams. And he was no longer just a person of interest. He was a fugitive. The hunt for Dante Williams began with a frustrating series of dead ends. His apartment, a minimalist, sterile space in a trendy warehouse district loft, was empty. It had been cleared of anything personal. Clothes, toiletries, a laptop, all gone. It wasn't the home of someone who planned to return. His workshop in Algiers was the same story. Wiped clean. The heavy machinery and workbenches remained, but the tools, materials, and finished products had vanished. He had liquidated his entire existence in a matter of hours. Detectives Chen and Miller ran his name through every database they had. His digital footprint was maddeningly small. No social media, a burner phone that had been disconnected hours after the murder, and credit cards that hadn't been used since the day before the party. Dante Williams had become a ghost. "He's smart," Chen muttered, staring at the blank screen of her computer. "He knew what he was doing. He planned this." "Panic makes you smart," Miller countered, rubbing his tired eyes. "He's running scared. The question is, where to?" Days turned into a week. The case was growing cold. The media had picked up the story, dubbing it the Yacht Party murder. But without a suspect, public interest was beginning to wane. The yacht owner's lawyer was already floating the idea that Dante himself might have been a second victim, a convenient fiction to close the book. Miller felt the case slipping through his fingers. He was haunted by the promise he'd made to Janelle, by the image of Tess's terror-filled eyes. That's when he decided to make a call he usually saved as a last resort. He called the K9 unit, not for a German shepherd trained in apprehension, but for a specialist. The next morning, a beat-up Ford Bronco pulled into the marina's parking lot. Out stepped a grizzled, weather-beaten officer named Thibodeau and his partner, a basset hound with ears so long they dragged on the ground, and a face that seemed permanently fixed in a state of mournful contemplation. His name was Gumbo. "Don't let the looks fool you," Thibodeau said, noticing Chen's skeptical expression. "This old boy's got a nose that can smell a memory." Thibodeau led Gumbo onto the Crescent Queen, letting him sniff around the cabin where Tess had died. The dog was slow, deliberate, his huge nose twitching, processing a world of information the humans couldn't perceive. Then he was led to the stern, to the spot where the dinghy had been tethered. Gumbo put his nose to the deck, let out a soft woof, and then began to pull, his powerful stumpy legs churning. The trail was almost 2 weeks old, contaminated by dozens of officers and the salt air, but Gumbo was locked in. He led them off the dock, through the bustling parking lot, to a thicket of overgrown bushes at the edge of the marina. There, snagged on a thorny branch, was a tiny scrap of dark fabric. Chen carefully bagged it. It matched the description of the shirt Dante was last seen wearing. Gumbo followed the scent trail for another half a mile to a bus station. The trail went cold there, lost in the miasma of exhaust fumes and 1,000 transient scents. It seemed like a dead end. But Thibodeau didn't give up. He and Gumbo spent the next hour circling the station in ever-widening rings. Suddenly, Gumbo's tail gave a tentative wag. He'd found it again. A faint, lingering trace on a discarded newspaper near a trash can. The trail led them away from the city, toward the swampy, forgotten wetlands west of town. It led them to a dirt road, and then to a barely-there path that disappeared into the oppressive humidity and buzzing insects of the bayou. After another hour of tracking through thick mud and Spanish moss, Gumbo stopped in front of a dilapidated, stilted fishing shack nearly swallowed by the swamp. He sat down, looked back at Thibodeau, and let out a single, triumphant bay. The SWAT team was called in. They surrounded the shack, weapons drawn, the silence of the bayou suddenly broken by the crackle of radios. "Dante Williams!" a voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is the NOPD. You are surrounded. Come out with your hands up." For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, the shack's flimsy door creaked open. Dante stepped out into the dapple sunlight, his hands raised. He was gaunt, his face covered in a scruff of beard, his eyes hollowed out. The arrogant artist was gone. In his place was a hunted animal, exhausted from the run. He blinked, not at the heavily armed officers, but at the sad-eyed basset hound, sitting calmly in the mud. The unlikely hero who had sniffed out his secret from the very air he breathed. The silence of the bayou had finally been broken. The trial of Dante Williams was a somber, media-saturated affair. The prosecution, led by a sharp assistant district attorney, didn't try to prove premeditated murder. Instead, they built their case on a foundation of two powerful arguments: criminal negligence and depraved indifference to human life. They brought in engineering experts who testified that the fail-safe mechanism in the eternity pairs was deeply flawed, a product of arrogant design and insufficient testing. The sheared pin from Dante's own discard bin was presented as damning evidence of his awareness of the potential for catastrophic failure. Dante's defense attorney countered that it was a tragic accident, a one-in-a-million product malfunction that had blindsided his client. Dante himself took the stand, a shadow of his former charismatic self. He spoke in a low, broken voice, describing the moment the device failed, the blood, the panic. "I didn't know what to do," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I broke. I ran. I know it was wrong. I'll live with it for the rest of my life." But it was his actions after the snap of steel that became the crux of the case. The prosecutor was merciless in her cross-examination. "You say you panicked, Mr. Williams, but your panic seems to have been remarkably methodical. You panicked your way into wiping your fingerprints off every surface, didn't you? You panicked your way into grabbing your wallet and keys. You panicked your way onto a getaway boat and into hiding for 2 weeks. You didn't panic and call 911. You didn't panic and scream for help. You panicked and saved yourself, while Teresa Washington choked on her own blood, alone in that cabin." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict was read in a hushed courtroom, guilty of manslaughter and failure to render aid. As the judge delivered the sentence, 20 years in prison, with eligibility for parole in 15, Dante showed no emotion. He simply nodded, his eyes closed, as if accepting a fate he had known was coming. As he was led away in handcuffs, his gaze swept the gallery and met Janelle's for a fleeting moment. In her eyes, he didn't see hatred. He saw a profound, weary sadness, which was somehow a more damning judgment than any prison sentence. A few weeks later, Janelle stood before Tess's grave in a quiet cemetery on a gray, overcast afternoon. The small, simple headstone read, "Teresa Washington, beloved mother, cherished friend." She placed a bouquet of white lilies at its base, their sweet fragrance a stark contrast to the bitter finality of the place. She had followed the trial every day, searching for some kind of closure, some sense of justice, and in a way, she had found it. Dante was punished, but it felt like a hollow victory. A man's imprisonment could not fill the void Tess had left behind. As she stood there, the wind rustling the leaves of a nearby oak tree, she thought about the lesson in all this. It wasn't a simple one. It wasn't just about being wary of younger men or avoiding strange hobbies. The real painful truth was more complicated. Tess hadn't died because she was reckless or foolish. She had died because she was human. She had died because after years of being made to feel invisible, one person had made her feel seen, and she had clung to that feeling with everything she had. Her greatest vulnerability wasn't a desire for dangerous thrills. It was a deeply human craving for connection. Dante's real crime, Janelle realized, wasn't a flawed piece of steel. It wasn't even the initial accident. His real unforgivable crime was his cowardice. It was the choice he made in that cabin, in that singular moment when his creation failed and his character was truly tested. He had the chance to be a man, to face the consequences, to scream for help that might have saved her. Instead, he chose to be a ghost, to save himself and leave her to her fate. The most dangerous people in the world, she thought, aren't always the ones who intend to cause harm. They are the ones who, in a moment of crisis, love themselves more than they could ever love anyone else. And that was the bitterest lesson of all, a quiet truth left in the wake of a tragedy born from hope and ended by fear.